It falls the way it always falls in March, not heavily, but persistently. A quiet accumulation that buries the edges of things, that softens the world into a uniform white silence. The farmstead at Hinterkaifeck sits 60 miles north of Munich, at the end of a road that most people never take. One lamp burns in the window. Smoke rises from the chimney. The fields stretch out in every direction, empty and pale and enormous. Inside, 6 people sleep. They do not know this is their last night. And yet, and this is what has kept investigators awake, for 100 years part of them has known something was coming. For weeks, the signs accumulated like the snow outside. Footprints in the field that appeared without explanation, noises in the attic above their beds, keys that vanished from hooks, a newspaper on the kitchen table that none of them had ordered and none of them could explain. The family had talked about it. The patriarch had warned his neighbors. And still, they stayed. They knew someone was coming. They just didn't know it was already too late. The farm no longer stands. The Bavarian state had it demolished in 1923, 1 year after the murders, perhaps because no community can be asked to look indefinitely at the place where something that terrible happened. But the land remains, the road remains, and the case after more than 100 years remains officially open. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever confessed. Across 10 decades of investigation, 400 suspects questioned, and the full weight of modern DNA forensics applied to century-old evidence, the Hinterkaifeck murders have refused to yield their final answer. What separates this case from the thousands of cold cases that retreat quietly into history is the warning, the weeks of premonition that preceded the violence. The signs that the family saw, discussed, and could not bring themselves to act upon. This is not simply a murder mystery. It is a study in the distance between knowing something is wrong and knowing what to do about it, a distance that, for the Gruber family, proved fatal. To understand what happened on the night of March 31st, 1922, we have to understand the world that built them. Post-war Bavaria was a place in the early stages of losing its footing. The Great War had consumed its young men and its confidence, and the peace that followed offered neither prosperity nor clarity. The Kaiser was gone. The old certainties were dissolving. In the cities, politics was becoming volatile in ways that would, within a decade, become catastrophic. In the countryside, people held tighter to the old ways, to land, to family, to the rhythms of farming life that had structured existence for generations. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead sat in this world, as a place slightly apart from it. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, ran the farm with the kind of hard, competent authority that does not invite question. He was not a man people warmed to easily. He was known in the village as difficult, sharp-tongued, possessive, a man who believed deeply in handling his own affairs. His wife, Casilia, was 72, quieter, worn smooth by decades of marriage to a man like Andreas. Their daughter, Victoria, was 35, a widow officially. Her husband, Karl, had gone to war in 1914 and died there, which was unremarkable in Bavaria in 1914. What was remarkable was a whisper that followed Victoria that Karl had in fact returned briefly in 1915 and found his wife pregnant in a way that could not have been his doing. The child born from that pregnancy was a 7-year-old girl, also named Casilia, and the younger child in the house, Joseph, 2 years old, was the subject of a quieter and more disturbing village rumor, one that pointed not at an unknown lover, but at Andreas Gruber himself. The family carried the scandal the way communities force certain families to carry things not spoken aloud, but present in every slightly averted gaze, every conversation that paused when the Grubers passed. The household was completed by Maria Baumgartner, 44 years old. She was new. She had taken the position only 1 week before the end. New, because the previous maid had left abruptly, in a state of visible distress, with an explanation that has been quoted in every account of this case ever written. The house is haunted. she told people. "I cannot stay." She had heard footsteps above the ceiling at night, not the sound of a house settling, deliberate, slow, the footfall of something that breathed. She had found objects moved. She had felt, in the way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, that she was not alone in rooms where she should have been alone. She left on a Saturday. Maria Baumgartner arrived the following Friday. It was the last job Maria would ever take. The footprints appeared sometime in February or early March of 1922. Andreas Gruber found them on a morning when the new snow was clean enough to read a single set of tracks emerging from the forest path that bordered the property, crossing the open field, stopping at the machine room door of the farm. No tracks leading back. No explanation for who had made them or why they had come in. Apparently not left. Andreas showed the tracks to neighbors. He talked about them. He described them as if the act of describing might produce an answer that the tracks themselves refused to give. Then came the newspaper, a Munich paper, folded and left on the kitchen table, that no one in the house had ordered, no one had bought, no one had carried inside. It appeared the way the footprints appeared, not as an obvious intrusion, but as something slightly wrong inserted into the fabric of the ordinary. The house keys disappeared from their hooks. A thorough search turned up nothing, and in the attic, the dark, low space above the family's sleeping quarters, footsteps resumed. The sound of weight moving carefully across old timber at hours when the house below was quiet. Andreas Gruber told a neighbor within 2 weeks of the murders, "Someone has been living in our loft." He did not go to the police. He did not take his family into town. For Andreas, this was not a situation that required outside help. It was a situation that required a hard man to hold his ground. The farm was his. He had worked it for decades. He was not the kind of man who abandons what is his because of noises in the dark. What Andreas Gruber didn't know is that the noises in the dark were not waiting for him to act. They were waiting for something else entirely. March 31st, 1922. A Friday. The kind of day that does not announce itself chores completed, animals fed, the evening meal eaten around the table, children put to bed. The air inside smelled with smoke and the residue of cooking. The lamp burned low. The farm was quiet in the way farms go quiet at night, settling into the rhythms of rest. The investigators who came afterward reconstructed what followed from physical evidence alone, because no one who witnessed it survived to describe it. Andreas was likely first, drawn to the barn by a sound, perhaps, or simply by the habits of a farmer who checks his animals at the end of every day. In the barn, in the dark, he was struck from behind with the mattock. The blow was not designed to warn. It was designed to end. He was struck multiple times, the forensic record noted, with force sufficient to destroy the structure of the skull entirely. Casilia came next, then Victoria. The sequence suggests someone who was either extraordinarily fast or, more troublingly, that the victims came to the barn one by one, drawn by concern for the person before them, each one walking into the dark to find the person they were looking for. Little Casilia, 7 years old, was last among those in the barn. The forensic evidence from her body suggested she survived the longest, that she lay in the cold and the dark, injured, waiting. The investigators who documented this detail did so in language stripped of everything unnecessary. The fact itself was enough. Joseph, 2 years old, was killed in his bed inside the house. Maria Baumgartner, 1 week into her new position, was killed in her room. 6 people. One night, one weapon, used repeatedly and with patience. No firearm was discharged. No neighbor heard anything. The nearest farmhouse was a kilometer away across frozen fields, and the night absorbed everything. Afterward, the killer, or killers, did not leave. For days passed, for days in which smoke continued to rise from the Hinterkaifeck chimney, for days in which the livestock, cattle, horses, a cat were fed and watered, For days in which food was prepared in that kitchen, dishes were used, and someone lived in a house of 6 dead people as if nothing required urgency. The neighbors noticed the absence first. In a small rural community where people knew each other's schedules away, they knew the weather by long familiarity and constant proximity. 4 days without a sighting of any member of the Gruber family was not nothing. The children hadn't appeared at school. Smoke kept rising. No one came to the door. On April 4th, a group of neighbors and the local mayor made their way to Hinterkaifeck. What they found has been documented in case files and retold in investigations for 100 years, and it still defies easy comprehension. The house was warm. The stove had been fed. On the kitchen table sat a Munich newspaper dated April 2nd, purchased or delivered 2 days after every person on the farm who could have purchased it was dead. The animals were alive and in good condition. The ordinary surface of domestic life was almost intact. Almost. The bodies were in the barn. The adults had been partially covered, as if someone had made a cursory attempt at concealment not thorough enough to matter, but present enough to suggest deliberate thought. Little Kazilia lay separately. Joseph was in the house, in his bed. The men who entered that barn in April 1922 and found what was there, they carried it for the rest of their lives. Some refuse to describe it in specific terms. The official documents are clinical in a way that official documents become when the people writing them are trying to maintain some distance from what they are recording. The murder weapon was not found. Andreas Gruber's firearm, a loaded gun he kept for practical reasons, a rural Bavarian farmer, kept guns in 1922, was also gone. And outside, still preserved in the cold spring air, the footprints from the forest path were visible, coming toward the farm, not leaving. The investigation that followed was, for 1922, extensive. It was also compromised from the start in ways that would compound over the following century. The crime scene had been disturbed before investigators arrived by the neighbors who found the family, by the curious who came the days that followed, and by the 4 days of occupation by someone unknown who had rearranged, handled, and moved to the evidence before anyone with authority arrived to document it. The forensic science of 1922 was limited under the best conditions. These were not the best conditions. Over 100 people were questioned in the first weeks. That number eventually grew to more than 400 across the life of the investigation. And the name that kept surfacing, kept returning in interviews and in the instinct of investigators, was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was a neighboring farmer. He had been involved with Victoria Gruber in the years preceding the murders, and involvement that many in the village believed had produced Joseph, the 2-year-old boy. Schlittenbauer had been contributing financially to Joseph's upkeep, which gave him a financial motive of a grim and particular kind. He had also been among the first people inside the farmstead on April 4th, which some investigators noted with narrowed eyes. But the case against Schlittenbauer never solidified. The evidence was circumstantial, shaped more by the village's existing suspicions about him than by anything physical or conclusive. He was never charged. Other suspects moved through the investigation, and out the other side, vagrant workers who had passed through the region, a former farmhand who had left under bitter circumstances, and the figure who appears in case files simply as the unknown male from Munich, a man some witnesses believed they had seen near the farm, whose identity was never established, whose presence was never confirmed, and who has remained a ghost at the edge of the investigation ever since. Each thread pulled, each unraveled. In 2017, German investigators announced that advances in DNA technology had made it possible to analyze biological material preserved from the original crime scene hairs, trace evidence from what was believed to be connected to the murder weapon. The results were precise and completely unhelpful. The DNA matched no known suspect. It matched no one in any database. It belongs to a biological profile that is attached to no name, no record, No living or identifiable individual. A genetic signature of someone who did this, and who's otherwise left no trace in any system that could connect a profile to a person. The unknown male from Munich, if that is what the DNA represents, remains unknown. The 2017 results confirmed only that the killer was not among the 400 people previously investigated, that the answer, wherever it lives, is somewhere beyond the boundaries of what 100 years of effort could reach. Some researchers believe the crime required multiple people, that the speed of it, the control necessary to prevent 6 people from raising alarm, implies coordination between at least 2 killers. Others hold that a single individual, sufficiently deliberate and sufficiently cold, could have managed it alone. The truth is we don't know. We have a DNA profile and a silence. Let us sit for a moment with what we do not know. We do not know whose footprints crossed that field from the forest. We know they came. We know they stopped at the barn. We know no return tracks were ever found, which means the killer left by another route, or left after snowfall covered the exit, or the tracks were deliberately obscured by someone who had planned ahead. We do not know where Andreas Gruber's firearm went. A loaded gun on a Bavarian farm does not simply disappear. Either the killer took it, which implies premeditation and the desire to leave no weapon behind, or it lies somewhere in that soil, 100 years undiscovered. We do not know why the family stayed. This is, perhaps, the question that resists the longest. Andreas Gruber saw the footprints. He heard the attic sounds. He knew the keys were gone. He said out loud to people he trusted, "Something is wrong here. Someone has been in our loft." And he did not leave. For Andreas, this wasn't carelessness. It was a specific and fatal form of pride. The land was his. The farm was his. He was not the kind of man who concedes his own ground to a threat he hasn't yet seen clearly. That stubbornness, whatever virtues it may have expressed in other circumstances, held the family in place long enough for March 31st to arrive. And we do not know the motive. Without motive, we cannot know the killer. Without the killer, the circle never closes. Whether this was rooted in the scandal of Joseph's parentage, in a financial dispute, in a robbery that exceeded what the robber intended, or in something darker and more private that died with everyone who knew it, we cannot say. The case files contain 400 names and 0 answers. There is a particular kind of dread in warning signs that go unheeded not because the people who received them were foolish, but because they were ordinary. Andreas Gruber was not a naive man. He was not a man who failed to notice things. He noticed everything. He documented the strangeness, reported it to neighbors, cataloged it in his own methodical way. He simply could not bring himself to act on what he knew. This is not a uniquely 19th century failure. It is not a Bavarian failure or a rural failure or a failure of a less sophisticated time. It is a human one. The gap between sensing that something is wrong and knowing clearly enough to do something about it is a space most of us have inhabited. The footprints in the snow that we explain away. The noises in the attic we attribute to the house settling. The newspaper on the table we decide not to examine too closely. Most of us are lucky. The danger resolves itself, or moves on, or turns out to be less than we feared. Andreas Gruber was not lucky. Somewhere in Bavaria, the person who did this lived out the rest of their days. They grew old in the ordinary way, eating, working, perhaps sleeping soundly, perhaps not. They may have had families of their own. They moved through the decades while 6 people lay under crosses in a churchyard in Weidhofen, and the world rearranged itself around the space they had left. We will not find them now. 100 years of snow has covered every track.